And this is all in the light of the fact, as we heard in the news, more than 15,000 coronavirus cases, coming up to 16,000, coming on 16,000, went unpublished in the daily reports for over a week. Scientists have called for transparency over these delays in reporting infections. The Prime Minister blamed them on a computing issue when he was on the Andrew Marr programme yesterday. Computer says, I haven't got a clue what's going on. And those who tested positive were informed. 15,841 test results were not passed on to the data dashboards used for contact tracing. Who knows who's out there? Who knows what's happening in terms of the spreading that could be going on? Tom Harwood, reporter at Guy Fawkes website. Hello, Tom. How you doing?
I'm very well this morning, thank you.
Good stuff. And Polly Toynbee, columnist at The Guardian. You all right, Polly?
Yep, fine, thank you.
Good. And callers coming up, 08085 909 693. It's about trust, Harwood. Do you think people trust the government on how it's gone and how it's going and what's going to happen as we embark on this bumpy ride? Tom?
I think people broadly understand that right across the world, no one has managed this absolutely perfectly. I think everyone can see that whichever party is in control, even in this country, whether it's the Scottish Nationalist Party up in Scotland, whether it's Labour in Wales, whether it's Sinn Féin and the DUP in Northern Ireland, or indeed the Conservative Party in England, they've all moved at sort of the same pace, broadly the same systems in place, broadly the same restrictions and timing. And ultimately, this is an unprecedented crisis where there are going to be mistakes, there are going to be bumps in the road. I think everyone can understand and accept that. And when we're dealing with things like massive IT projects led by governments, I'm not sure that there are many people who would have assumed right at the beginning this would have been entirely smooth. But what what has happened really over the last 4 or 5 months in particular is a massive ramp up in that testing capacity, now at 300,000 tests a day, more than any other country in Europe. So yes, of course, it's right to point out those failures and where things can be improved, but also we should point out those successes and those particularly region-beating successes that this country has embarked upon.
Loads of stuff to consider this morning. Cometh the hour, cometh the man. The hour came, is it the right man? Boris Johnson. Tom?
I think that this is a really tough thing for any politician who's sort of styled themselves as a freedom-loving person to embark upon, because, of course, this is a collective action problem. This is a virus that requires government intervention. And from a government that is sceptical about government intervention, that's a very hard circle to square. That's a very
But in
hard
his
thing to do
interviews
to restrict the
with
liberty
a number
of
of journalists over the weekend and before, he comes across as a man who hasn't got a blinking Scooby-Doo.
I think that that's a little bit unfair, given that there have been some remarkable successes from this government in terms of the latter response to this virus. As I say, the testing capacity has increased by more than any other country in Europe. That is.
I'm not talking about this government. I'm talking about Mr. Johnson. There's been much praise for Rishi Sunak. According to the Conservative Home website, he's now the most popular Tory by a mile, and Boris Johnson is right at the bottom. The only person below him is Gavin Williamson. If he were to fall below Gavin Williamson, all bets are off. But, he's not a detailed man. He's not a details man. And isn't this the time for a details man?
Well, if you look at some leaders around the world who have been in charge of the details, I look at Shinzo Abe in Japan, who's just resigned in part because of his unpopularity over the response to coronavirus. Even though Japan has done relatively well in the world, the popularity of him decreased markedly. And I think that many leaders around the world, the ones who actually are sort of in control of what's going on, the ones who have responsibility, this has been an incredibly challenging time for just about everyone. Emmanuel Macron as well in France seeing falls in popularity. I think that whoever is in charge, whoever the buck stops with, is going to face this kind of pressure. And as for Rishi Sunak, of course, it's very, very popular to start giving people free money and all this sort of stuff. I think that popularity might not necessarily last when the repercussions of that profligate spending come to pass, when people actually have to pick up the tab for what has been going on over the last few weeks and months, the billions of pounds that have been spent, the unprecedented engorging of the national debt, that has consequences. And whilst it's okay when you're spending money to be a chancellor to be very popular, that doesn't always last.
Polly Toynbee, it's all about trust. And most people are going with this, aren't they, Polly?
I think people want to believe that the government is giving the right advice. It's interesting that even though there's lots of anger, and certainly lots of anger with Johnson, who doesn't seem to be capable of being in control of this, there remains, encouragingly, a lot of belief that people should follow the rules. And that's really important. I mean, when that goes, we're really in trouble. We're into sort of anarchy territory. So thank goodness for that. But we remain the country that's had the highest death rate per head of population, apart from America, and and the worst economic catastrophe. We've done both badly, because it was always the question of balancing: when do we get people back to work, how do we save the economy, versus how do we stamp down on the virus. And plainly the eat out to help out set off a whole train of events of people saying, right, it's all fine to go out now, that we will look back on as having been a very expensive mistake, cost a lot of money. It saved the hospitality industry for a very short time, but at the moment we shut down again.
But
of course,
without an economy
closes.
and without the wheels of the economy moving, there will be no money for the NHS in the short term, in the medium term, or on the long term. So we have to strike that balance. And haven't this government, because they are the party of business, haven't they understood that instinctively and done their best with that?
Indeed, that's true. There is actually no conflict between economy and health, because unless we can get the virus under control, then the economy will be closed down. So both things absolutely have to go together. I mean, what's interesting about this government is it absolutely isn't the government of business. For the first time, I think, in my lifetime. After all, remember, Boris famously was heard saying F business, and he meant it, because the whole of the Brexit enterprise was against the interests of business. The CBI, the IOD, all of the rest of them appalled at what it would do to business, and business still shouting loudly about how we need to have a deal.
Let me throw that back to Tom Harwood.
That's no longer the priority. This government has other interesting priorities, but it's not business.
Okay, Tom Harwood.
I think that there is certainly something there in terms of, for example, you look at a policy like the hospitality curfew that seems to be deeply counterproductive. But if you look at the opposition to a policy like that in Parliament, the opposition, the official opposition, the Labour Party, is nowhere to be seen. Bridget Phillipson was on the radio this morning and she was asked about the curfew, and she couldn't come up with an answer. She couldn't say what Labour's position is on it because they don't have a position. The opposition to the anti-business measures is coming from Conservative backbenchers at the moment. It seems like the official opposition in Parliament is nowhere to be seen because they don't want to be blamed for whichever way it goes. They're being completely silent and offering no opposition. And actually we have to look to figures like Graham Brady and Steve Baker from the Conservative backbenchers to be giving these messages about where the government might be getting this wrong. And I think that's
but both wings of
Can I just say an answer to that?
Stay out. On you go. Yeah,
what's important that Labour's saying is it should be down to local mayors, local authorities. If you listen to the likes of Andy Burnham in Greater Manchester, that is where the answers are to be found. They say, give us the power. From the beginning, you should have given us the test and trace because we know our locality. Also, they already had experts doing that work, and I've spoken to an awful lot of them, not call centres newly hired from Serco, who've been a disaster. Give us the power and give us the money and give us the authority to say where should be closed down, when, and when it should be opened up again. Also, just give us the criteria, because you haven't even given us that, to tell us, all right, at what R level should somewhere be closed down? At what R level should they be let out again? There is no criteria. It's been really random. And a lot of people have suspected increasingly quite political, where certain Tory places have not been locked down, even though their R rate is worse than some of the places that have been. It's quite random. I think that this government's despising of local authority is at the heart of what's gone most wrong about dealing with this crisis.
Tom, is Boris likely to stand as leader of the Conservatives at the next election? Because Rishi Sunak is an impressive figure and Mr Johnson has critics, as you were saying, not just on the Graham Brady and Bernard Jenkin wing of the Conservative Party, but on the other wing of the Conservative Party as well, on the backbenches. He's getting the bucket of nasty stuff from everyone at the moment, isn't he?
I mean, the Conservative Party is lucky to have so many sort of bright talents, and Boris certainly hasn't shied away from promoting talent to his shadow cabinet. I think some previous prime ministers have sort of been afraid of talent in the cabinet and sort of have filled it with non-entities, and I think that's certainly not the case now. But
Who are the
really,
big figures? Who are the big towering? Who are the big towering?
The towering
talents?
figures. Well, I mean, if you look at people like Rishi Sunak, obviously a very impressive politician, only elected in 2015 and already at the height of chancery. If you look at people like Michael Gove, a man who's more on top of detail, who can change the internal mechanisms of any department from which he is put into more than any other cabinet minister in recent years. There are so many people in this cabinet who I think are very impressive and talented individuals. However, what I would say is less than a year ago, this government won an 80-seat majority on a higher percentage of the vote than even Tony Blair managed to achieve in 1997. This is a government with an impressive mandate, and I think that most Conservative MPs would recognise that that mandate would not have been won by any politician other than Boris Johnson. He was the only person who at that time, in that mess, following that disastrous, pathetic hung parliament, who could have won that victory. And so I think that there is some residual loyalty there from all of those new, particularly Northern Tory MPs, who feel a great affinity towards the Prime Minister. And ultimately, we're mid-term. This happens to every Prime Minister there has ever been. There was an attempted coup against David Cameron back in 2011, 2012. Michael Foot led Margaret Thatcher in opinion polls in 1982. I mean, if you look at anyone, even Tony Blair fell behind William Hague in opinion polls at one stage in 2001. So this is not an unprecedented
That was to do with petrol,
situation.
wasn't it?
Yeah, that was
it
for a couple of weeks over a petrol crisis. I think this is a bit extreme.
One more, Polly
myself.
Toynbee, and then, I mean,
Yes.
Michael Gove famously said, we've had enough of experts. We're going to speak to the experts in just a moment. The experts are Devon in London and Mark in Northumberland. They're coming first. Those are the first two experts. This is about you, but it's fascinating hearing from Polly Toynbee and Tom Harwood. Quick response to Tom, Polly, then we'll get into it.
Well, the Tory party is very good at one thing, at self-preservation. If Boris Johnson looks like he's become their loser, they will dish him sooner or later, probably a bit closer to the next election. Labour's very bad at doing that. You know, it should have ejected Corbyn, it should have ejected Gordon Brown when it was clear he was going to go into crash. Labour doesn't do it, but the Tories do. So they will remake themselves in time of the next election. I doubt it'll be Sunak, because by then he will be responsible for mass unemployment as the furlough scheme unwinds.
Well, he's not responsible for mass unemployment, is
well,
it? This,
it will amount.
Crisis.
I mean,
there will be
in the same way. In the same way that Labour was blamed for a global crash, and the Tories said, "Oh, look, Labour did that."
Yeah, but you spent your time saying that Labour weren't to
Tories,
blame for a Tory crash. For a global
for
crash.
a Labour collapse. No, they weren't indeed, and actually Gordon Brown
the
dealt
Tories
with it
aren't to
rather
blame
well.
for this.
They're not to blame for the virus, not at all. But they are taking the flak for it. They are certainly to blame for having handled it so badly, for their messaging being so unclear that people are quite angry at not knowing who should be doing what in what part of the country. And messaging ought to be the basic thing a government can get right. Very difficult to stamp out the virus.
Polly, you're arguing for lots of different messages from localities, from different mayors. Surely that would be more confusing than a national strategy. I'm not sure
I think very clear message.
Let's hold that thought. It's a fascinating bone of contention, and there are so many. It's a moot point as to whether the government will be, quote, responsible for mass unemployment, given what we're going through.